Good morning, and we are beginning this morning with our Sunday morning Bible class, an introduction to the book of Ruth. We'll be studying the book of Ruth over the next few weeks, and I hope that you'll be able to join us for this. Justin, is the clicker back there? The long, skinny? Yes. Will you bring it to me? I got my tech support in here with me this morning, taking care of things. He's doing an awesome job. So we're up and streaming. Got some issues worked out this week. Mr. Kyle Forrester, one of our elders, has been in here working hard, changing out lights, getting new software up and going to hopefully fix the issues we had last week. And we have a tech person now. My oldest son's in here, and he's being our tech person, so he's doing a good job. Very proud of him. So this morning we're going to begin in the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth. There we go. Hopefully you can see the PowerPoint on the screen, and we'll be looking at this book over the next few weeks. It's only 4 chapters. It really won't take us that long, but we want to do a good, thorough study of the book. We'll be spending some time looking at a lot of elements of this book, and today what we're going to focus on is the introductory material. The author of the book. Now, the author of the book, no author is named in the text, so that leaves us in the realm of speculation. There's a great question that we cannot have a permanent answer for. A lot of some scholars are going to attribute the book to Samuel the prophet, being written during the years of David before he becomes king. Remember, the argument against Samuel the prophet is that David was not yet king when Samuel dies. Well, David was anointed by Samuel, by God, really. God sent Samuel to anoint David to become king. So that was, that was a sure thing in the mind of Samuel. David was also gained a lot of popularity. David was a very famous individual in the realm of Israel. Remember, while Saul was king, one of the things that enraged Saul against David was after David joined the army and started going out and fighting battles, when he would come back marching triumphantly, the women would sing their song of Saul has killed his thousands and David his 10,000s. So you have a great popularity in King David at this, in David at this point in his life. He would be a character, an individual of great interest to all the Israelite nation, not just because he was going to become king, but because of his prowess on the battlefield. He had already married the daughter of Saul, and he had been anointed to become king in the place of Saul. So there is the possibility of Samuel writing it. Others would attribute it to King David himself or Solomon, or some have even mentioned all the way down the line to Hezekiah. Could that be possible? Yes. Others point to Nathan the prophet. A lot would point to, because of the similarities between the book of Ruth and the book of Judges, that it would point to the author of Judges also being the author of the book of Ruth. So, it's one of those things we don't know. We cannot pin down who it is. We're in the realm of speculation. Some would go as far as pointing to the author being from the post-exilic age of in the 400s BC, looking at some of the wording that is used in the text to point to that. But again, we don't know. We don't know who wrote it, nor do we know when it was written. Like the author, it's a very hotly contested. The range given as in my study of prepping for this class varies between 1011 BC, right before the death of Samuel, all the way to 400 BC. We don't really know. It does seem to predate the book of 1 Samuel. The reason we look at it as predating the book of 1 Samuel, when King David, or David before he becomes king, when Saul is striving to capture David and kill him, David flees to the land of Moab. The book of 1 Samuel doesn't give a whole lot of detail of why David would choose Moab from the lands around him. And so the thought frame is, well, the book of Ruth tells us why David would choose Moab, because in the book of Ruth, David's ancestry is shown that he is the descendant of a Moabite. And so he would be fleeing back to the land of a ancestor towards family. So that is the thought frame of why we feel it predates the book of 1 Samuel. It could really vary in a lot of ways of when it could be. I'm going to give you some dates here. David began to reign in 1010 BC. Remember, he reigned in Hebron over Judah before he reigned over all Israel. So in 1010 he began to reign. We look at Samuel died right before that, probably 1011. The 1013 is the span we're looking at, the death of Samuel. David was the youngest son of Jesse, and he was anointed. If we place David's birth in the 50th year of his father's life, Jesse would have been born in the first year of the Philistine oppression, or 48 years after the death of Gideon. It is quite possible that Jesse may also have been a younger son of Obed, born in the 50th year of his father's life. If so, the birth of Obed would fall in the last years of Gideon, or about 1150 BC. And the last event mentioned in the book is the birth of David. So, you're looking at this, the birth of Obed, the son of Ruth and Boaz. Really we're looking at the time frame of when it probably took place, of what's going on in the book was probably in the between 1200 BC and 1150 BC, in that time range. What's going to take place in the book, the actual writing of the book, we don't know. So it really could vary. It really could vary. Okay, so we again, David had already risen to great fame before the death of Samuel. We're going to go with the early date on this of 1011 BC as we go through the book, just because probably won't even mention the date again, but it doesn't matter. It does not change the message of the book. The author does not change the message of the book. These are good things to have, to know. There's nothing wrong with thinking about them. We just don't want to focus on that and lose what's important. Okay, so the name of the book. The name of the book was named after the main character of Ruth. Ruth in the Hebrew is pronounced much the same as the English word of Ruth. It means comrade, companion, or neighbor. It's also, the same word is also found in Exodus chapter 11 and verse 2 in a common setting. I'm going to turn over there and read that for you. Exodus 11 and verse 2. Speak now in the hearing of the people, that they ask every man of his neighbor and every woman of her neighbor for silver and gold jewelry. So neighbor there in Exodus 11 and verse 2 would be the same word as the name of Ruth in this text. So that's the meaning of her name. Okay. She was a Moabitess, and we'll look at that a little more in a minute as we get towards the end of this lesson, okay? Placement. The placement, when we talk about placement, it's where it is arranged in the text. Remember, the Old Testament, the Hebrew Old Testament, was arranged in a certain order. You had the first 5 books, the Pentateuch, you had, or the law, then you had the prophets, and then you had the writings. So in ancient Hebrew, it was stuck with Judges. The way we do it, we have, in similar fashion, you have the Pentateuch, you have history, then you have poetry or wisdom literature, and then the major prophets and the minor prophets in the English version of the Old Testament. In the ancient Old Hebrew Bibles, it was placed with Judges. Later, the more modern, which is not really modern to us, but the later Hebrew text would place it in the 3rd section with the writings. The Septuagint placed it in the historical books. We place it in with Judges in our English translations. It is not an appendix to the book of Judges. It is its own book doing its own thing, but it does take place during the book of Judges, and that's going to be important. We'll look at that in a minute. This was a very important book. It's a very small book. It's one of those books in the Old Testament. We have 2 books named after women, Esther and Ruth. In each of these books, we do not see God with a direct hand with a prophet saying, "Thus says the Lord." It is a book showing the providence of God and the faithful obedience of His people in dangerous and difficult times as an example to us. Remember what Paul wrote. The Old was written for our learning. For our learning. We learn from studying the Old Testament. And so we find in there the book of Ruth was a very important book to the Jewish people. It was read every year in the Feast of Weeks. The Feast of Weeks we call Pentecost. It took place Exodus chapter 34 and verse 22 and Deuteronomy chapter 16 and verse 10. It takes place 50 days after Passover. It's 7 Sabbaths and the morrow. So 7 Sabbaths, 7 times 7, 49, and the morrow, 50. Pentecost, remember, is a Gentile, it's a Greek term for that festival of 50. Penta, pentagram's a 5-pointed star. The Pentagon is that big military building with 5 sides. A pentagon also is it's named after the shape it's built, a 5-sided hexagon, or polygon. It's a 5-sided polygon. So Pentecost, 50. So it was read every year to the Jewish people during that Feast of Weeks. It shows God's providence of going to take care of His people. Okay, the purpose of the book. The purpose of the book is to give a biological sketch of the righteous ancestors of David, the man destined to become Israel's king. It shows examples of a family loving one another as God had planned. Family is to be the caretakers of each other. They are to love one another. They are to be together and watch over and take care of each other. And so we find that example in the book. It shows faithfulness of God's people in trying times. God was not standing over top of them with His finger on them saying, "You do this right now," whispering in their ears. It was the simple fact of God's people who had an understanding and knowledge of Him and His Word, simply living their lives, carrying out faithful obedience to Him in difficult times at all points in their life. And so we find a wonderful example of the providence of God. I don't know if everybody has had the opportunity to hear Brother Ralph Gilmore speak about the providence of God. If you ever have the opportunity and you have not, please, I beg of you, please make every effort to hear Brother Ralph Gilmore speak on that topic. He does such an excellent job showing the non-miraculous, interactive providence of God. Wow. It is truly tremendous, and we find that here. God's not moving mountains. He's not raising the dead, yet He is guiding Ruth, the Moabitess, Naomi. He is guiding Boaz. He is guiding these people through His non-miraculous, interactive providence. And it's beautiful in this book. It gives us a good understanding of the providence of God as we study this book. And it shows that in here. It also shows God's acceptance of all those that come to Him through faithful obedience. We get wrapped up sometime in looking at the Old Testament and think it's only about the Jewish people. It's about God's people. You go back to the book of Genesis and you find Melchizedek, who is the priest, the king priest of the God Most High. Hebrews is going to talk about that. You're going to find in here, you're going to find Uriah the Hittite, the wife of Bathsheba. You're going to find in David's army so many foreigners that have came and to become faithful to God. You have Rahab the prostitute to come and be faithful to God. You have Ruth, a Moabitess, to come and be faithful to God. And it shows God's acceptance no matter your background, no matter the color of your skin, no matter your ancestry, no matter where you're from or what language you speak. If you'll come unto God and be faithful unto Him, He will accept you and He will protect you and He will be with you through your life, and in forevermore you will be with Him. And so it just paints a beautiful picture of God's acceptance of sometimes those that the rest of us just struggle with accepting. And we need to learn to see that example of God's acceptance of others that are different than us. So it's a beautiful, beautiful picture of how God accepts these people. This book is, the plan of the book, it's a straightforward historical narrative. There are no poetic passages, though the work is presented in good Hebrew prose. Again, it's a book that is a resounding sermon of God's providence over all things. even the seemingly insignificant product of chance. Ruth wandering into Boaz's field. A lot of fields around. She goes right into his field. It's beautiful how God directs the steps of his people through providence and through his plan to bring in this Moabite, this woman who is going to show her faithfulness in such a wonderful way. Okay, lessons from the book. Things are not always as they would appear. Bethlehem means house of bread. Remember at the beginning of the book, the reason they leave Bethlehem is because there is a famine in the land. There is no bread in the house of bread. Things can be deceiving sometimes. So keep that in mind. How you treat others often has an effect on how they see God. You take Naomi and her husband and their sons, Mahlon and Chilion, and how they treated these Moabitess girls, these Moabite women. And after, Naomi's husband dies, then her sons marry local girls. And let's think for a minute about who we're dealing with here in Moab. These are the descendants of Lot and his oldest daughter. If you go back into the book of Genesis and you find the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot and his daughters and his two young daughters and his wife take off. His wife looks back. She is turned into a pillar of salt. There's a lot of theological argument over what that means. She died. She's gone. Lot and his daughters flee. They're going to flee to a village. Wife turns into a pillar of salt, whatever you take that, whether she was a statue made of salt or that something else, and that's what the description is of. I don't know. There's, like I said, there's philosophy, there's arguments, there's arguments about that by scholars, and you can study that. Okay, so they flee. His wife dies. They're going to a small village. Lot gets scared, so instead of going to a small village, him and his two daughters run and hide in a cave in the woods, in the mountains. And his daughters decide, we're not going to be able to have children. We're not going to be able to be married. So, basically they come up with a plan to inebriate their father and have relations with him. The first daughter does, and she conceives, and a son is born, and his name is Moab. And the descendants of Moab are the Moabites. The second son, Ammon, is the Ammonites. He is born to the youngest daughter, who they carry out the plan again so that the youngest daughter can get pregnant and conceive a child, and she does, and his descendants become the Ammonites. So you have the Moabites and Ammonites, children born of incest, distant relatives of the Israelite people, who did not like the Israelite people. When the Israelites are marching back into out of Egypt back into the land of promise, the land of Canaan, the Moabites and the Ammonites were not real friendly with them. A lot of problems there, and they're going to be the thorns in the side of the Israelite people all the way through into captivity. So you're going to find issues with these people there. And then you take how this family treated these girls, who they knew their background, the history of their people, and they treated them with such love and respect, even though they were different than them, that when their husbands die, they cling to their mother-in-law, not wanting to leave her. And she has to convince them. Out of her love for them, she wants them to be able to remarry and have children. She knows that her state of a widowed woman without sons, without a husband, life was going to be hard for her. She did not want that for them girls. And so she tried to send them back to their family. One goes back, the other one makes a vow to stay with her and just will not leave her and makes that commitment. Your God is my God, your people are my people. You know, where you go, I'm going. So it's a beautiful, beautiful picture. And she wouldn't have made that statement about God, if she hadn't seen God lived out in the life of Naomi and her family. And so how you treat others, remember that book of 1 John chapter 4 really paints that picture for us of how we treat others as a reflection on how our faith in God and how we see God. And so it's in how others see God through us. Another lesson is through bitter times, God can take us to a place of great rejoicing. You know, we often in our lives struggle with that fact of how do we, you know, things are so tough and this is happening and that's happening. And, you know, I mean, especially over the last, for my generation, it's been a tough time for us over the last few months. We have never had to experience something like this. We did not go through the rationing of World War I and II. We did not go through the Great Depression. We did not go through Korea and Vietnam and these things. And so now for us, you know, because, you know, the worst thing about Desert Storm and Desert Shield when I was sixth grade was, you know, you couldn't watch, you know, Who's the Boss because, you know, General Schwarzkopf was on TV every night. Well, you know, we played video games. We watched VHS movies. You know, it was not that bad. It did not interrupt our life other than interrupting our TV a little bit. You know, now these things have interrupted our life, and it's crazy in so many ways of, you know, in serving the church as a minister. I'm used to being at the hospital. I'm used to being at people's homes, especially when somebody's sick, when somebody, you know, when there's a loved one about to die or has died, being at the funeral home, being at the graveside, even when I'm not performing the funeral, but I'm there in support, and not being able to do that and seeing families hurting that you're not able, and individuals you're not able to reach and put your arm around. When you see them in pain, it's hard for those situations for everybody involved. But through these difficult times, God can carry us through, and I know these times are nowhere near as bad as the others in history. But through these bitter times in our lives, the loss of loved ones, the loss of jobs, the loss of spouses, through through the loss of our material possessions, all these bitter times that we can go through in life, God, if we'll stay faithful to Him, God can carry us through those into a place of great rejoicing. And that's what we see through this book. You see Naomi, who leaves Bethlehem blessed and fortunate, who returns and says, "Don't call me Naomi anymore, call me Mara," which is bitter. Bitter because she felt she has been treated bitterly by God. Her life is bitter. And then at the end of the book, what do we find? We find Naomi rejoicing, holding her grandson. And the statement is made of, "Your daughter-in-law has been better to you than 7 sons." She has been just... what a blessing Ruth was to Naomi. And so even in our difficult, bitter times, we need to look for our blessings that are there. And remember, if we stay faithful, God can carry us through to a better day. Okay. So let's look at some outlines of the book. I have several outlines I want to go through with you on this, and then we'll have some wrap-up information. Okay, so the first outline we're looking at, and remember, the Bible was not originally written in book, chapter, verse. It was written in book. It was written as a letter. So the chapter breaks, the verse breaks were not there. When they divided the book of Ruth, it was divided very well. So our outline is going to be chapter by chapter. And so chapter 1, Ruth comes to Bethlehem. We have the introduction in verses 1 through 7. Ruth's determination to remain with Naomi, verses 8 through 18, and the arrival in Bethlehem, verses 19 through 22. Chapter 2, Ruth meets Boaz. Ruth gleans in the fields, verses 1 through 7. The kindness of Boaz, verses 8 through 16. Ruth returns to Naomi, verses 17 through 23. Ruth appeals to Boaz. Chapter 3, Naomi's advice, 1 through 5, verses 1 through 5. Ruth speaks to Boaz, verses 6 through 13. Ruth returns to Naomi, verses 14 through 18. Ruth marries Boaz. Chapter 4, the kinsmen approach, verses 1 through 8. Boaz takes Ruth, verses 9 through 12. Ruth bears a son, verses 13 through 17. And then the ancestry of David, verses 18 through 22. Okay, now H. Gunkel, and I like the way he did this. H. Gunkel said each chapter has a main and a secondary scene. So chapter 1, you have the introduction, verses 1 through 6. The main scene, verses 7 through 18, Naomi and her daughters-in-laws. And then the secondary scene was 19 through 22, Naomi's return to Bethlehem. Chapter 2, main scenes, verses 1 through 17, Ruth gleans in Boaz's field. The secondary scene, verses 18 through 23, light first shines for Ruth and Naomi. Chapter 3's main scene is verses 1 through 15. Ruth goes to Boaz on Naomi's advice. And then the secondary scene is 16 through 18, Ruth's talk with Naomi. And then the last chapter 4, main scenes 1 through 12 is the legal transaction of dealing with, because what came with Naomi as well, with Ruth as well, is the land, the family land. Just because they left to go to Moab, they did not lose their ancestral home or land. That was a permanent, remember, even if you sold it, it was only sold for so long, and then the year of Jubilee, it was returned back to the family, and you based everything on how far away that was going to be, for what you sold it for how many years somebody else was. So basically, you didn't really sell your land. You leased it to someone else for an X amount, and it came back to the family. So with a few exceptions. Okay, so the secondary scene was verses 13 through 17, a conclusion, a son for Naomi, and then the final conclusion, 18 through 22, with the ancestry of David. So that's a very good outline as well, looking at, you know, a main and a secondary scene through the book. Okay, so the next one, the outline, and I think this will be our last one. Chapter 1, Ruth the Moabitess led to Israel. You got the introduction, the death of Elimelech and his sons, Mahlon and Chilion, and Moab, verses 1 through 6, Ruth's return with Naomi and her pledge of fidelity, 7 through 18. And I want to interject something real quick here, because I think this is important. As we study through the book, Ruth is not praised for her dedication to God in this book. She's praised for her dedication to her mother-in-law, to Naomi. So it is just, again, how we treat others is how others see God in us. So it's a beautiful, beautiful thought. Okay, so back to the topic. Back to, as my brother-in-law would say, meanwhile, back at the motel. Okay, so Ruth's return with Naomi and her pledge of fidelity, verses 7 through 18, and Naomi and Ruth's arrival in Bethlehem, verses 19 through 22. Chapter 2, Ruth's meeting with Boaz, gleaning in Boaz's field, verses 1 through 17. New hope for Naomi, verses 18 through 23. prospect on the horizon for her. So, chapter 3, Ruth and Boaz at the threshing floor, verse 1 through 15. Boaz's answer, and 16 through 18. And then chapter 4, that was chapter 3, chapter 4, is Boaz's marriage to Ruth and the birth of Obed. Ruth's kinsman, redeemer, and husband, verses 1 through 12. Boaz, the father of Obed and forefather of David, verses 13 through 22. So, as we're going to study through the book of Ruth, we're going to study about a journey. They're going to travel. Elimelech, Naomi, and their 2 sons are going to travel some approximate. We're not for sure exactly where they went in Moab. To get to Moab from Bethlehem, they're going to travel up above the Dead Sea to a ford, a crossing point in the Jordan River. Across the Jordan River, going east, and then they're going to go south into Moab. We project somewhere around 60 miles of this would be this journey. Don't know exactly the number of miles. If we're going by the rule of thumb some would use when you're hiking of 20 miles a day is a good long day. That would be 3 days. What we're looking at here, they suspect, was probably closer to 7 to 10 days. Rough terrain, rough walking, not really a situation like we have today with the advancement of things. We don't know how far up the Jordan they had to go. It was a famine in the land. Does that mean there was a drought also? We don't know. Remember, the Jordan River goes well beyond the Sea of Galilee, up to Lake Huron and above, where the tributaries coming down. We don't know exactly where it is. The Jordan River itself ranges from 80 to 100 feet wide. It ranges from 5 to 12 feet deep. So at 5 feet deep, you don't want to wade through 5 feet. You definitely don't want to swim across at 12 feet. There's some places where during the dry season you can walk across, not wind up, neck deep. So, did they have to go up and walk across? Was the river down low enough? Was it the dry season? Or did they have to take a ferry and go to a point where there was a ferry? We don't know exactly where it was. So we're looking at this journey of several days to get away to where there's food. Then they get there, things, they stay long enough for Elimelech to die, for Mahlon and Chilion to meet girls, arrange marriages, for them to die, and then for these women to start the journey back and sending Orpah home, and Ruth coming back with Naomi all the way to Bethlehem. Remember what we talked about, it deals with the descendants of the Moabites. Those born in incest, those born in not the best of situations, and yet God chooses this young Moabite woman to be in the lineage of his Messiah. And, it's a wonderful picture of how God loves the faithful and how he can give glory where man can't. So it's just a beautiful picture of that. It takes time in a period of great personal rebellion and rejection of God. Judges chapter 17 and verse 6. Remember chapter 1 and verse 1 of the book of Ruth, and during the time of Judges. Judges 17 and verse 6 and 21 and verse 25. It said everyone did there was no king in the land, and everyone did what's right in his own eyes. Very similar to today. What's right for me is not right for you. Kind of humanistic mentality of, I do my truth's not your truth, who can know truth, all these issues that come up with this. And, it's hey, I do what I want to do. If it feels good, do it, man. And so you find that concept within the book here. It's during a time of just great upheaval. Though the book is filled, begins with great distress, great issues, great sorrow, the book of Ruth is a book of love. We focus on the book. We use it to teach young people about husbands and wives, and we focus on the book as the love between Boaz and Ruth, but really it's the love of Ruth and Naomi, daughter and mother. How she truly left her biological parents and clung to her new family, and just really that deep-seated love for Ruth for Naomi, and Naomi truly for Ruth, and looking out for what's best for her, helping her to get in a better situation. And it's a message, it's one of beauty, setting the stage for the account of the tender love of Hannah, the mother of Samuel. Those mothers included in these two books just really paint such a beautiful picture of motherhood. It set the bar high, and it's just a blessing to get to study these books. So we're going to study the book of Ruth. It'll take us several weeks. We'll be going through the book. I'm not going to promise a chapter or a lesson. We're going to go through at the pace that we feel we can go through and get good meat out of the book. Hopefully nothing that's going to choke anybody up, but enough to where it's going to spur you on for your own personal study. I do appreciate you being with us this morning, and we hope that you'll join us today for our either here in person or online through our YouTube page for our live stream worship today. Thank you, and God bless. Have a wonderful day.